So we're going to end up probably with 2 recordings, but that's all right. Let's go ahead and actually talk about some of the things for this week. Environmental issues, as I said, are they range from global to local. From climate change to the Animas River getting flooded or from that stuff from that mine where it turned yellow. So that's more of a local issue. Of course, it became a wider issue because, of course, that's heading off into eastern Colorado. So the problem, and then others are things like the water supply in Flint, Michigan. So, and the environmental issues are affecting a lot of people's health, but environmental issues can help and affect. With changing of environments. I just saw an article this morning about insects are starting now in this global climate change, warming. We expect to see anywhere from 10 to 25% increase in insect damage to major food crops like wheat and corn and soybeans for every 1 degree centigrade of change in temperature. So that alone can be devastating to our food supply. But if the weather starts changing and if things happen like the prediction that I read was I think by the end of this century, and of course we're looking at a long-term issue here. I don't expect to be around at the end of this century. However, that doesn't mean anything. My children might very well be, and certainly my grandchildren. So what's happening with our changing weather conditions is that by the end of the century, it's expected that Denver's climate will be that of current day Las Cruces, New Mexico, so southern New Mexico. So no snow in the mountains and rainfall even less than we're having now. So that in itself will affect the ability of Eastern Plains farmers to grow crops all through this state and all through northern New Mexico, where the San Luis Valley and other areas around there are important food sources for us. So weather change will do that. The problem with looking at environmental issues, and public health concerns itself not just with diseases, but with every kind of environment, or every kind of change in environment, in patterns of disease, in patterns of population movement that affect general public health. As cities become more crowded, we're seeing increases in proximity-related diseases, things like infectious disease. If someone gets sick and you're in a crowded environment, literally everybody around you will get sick. Just today, a plane landed in New York. It was flying from Dubai to New York. So it was an Emirates plane with at least 100 people on it who had gotten sick in the air in a matter of about, it's about a 15-hour flight, I think, to Dubai from New York. Might be a little bit less, but it's a long flight. So this is a plane load of about 500 people, and 20% of them are getting sick, and everybody else theoretically has to be concerned about being exposed to whatever has made these people ill. That just happened today. So there's a lot that is concerning. That kind of thing, the public health authorities in New York are obviously concerned about what is it. And the people were quarantined on the plane and then transported to a medical facility as quickly and as efficiently as possible. But still, we now have that question: why is it that 100 people, 20% of a flight of people, at least, have gotten ill essentially simultaneously? So that's a public health issue. So the other things that come in are that we're talking about factors within the environment and how they need to be monitored. There's a lot of these that we see. I mean, we've seen it over the years. My posting on this week's discussion, my initial posting, was about asbestos. And the question really concerns if about workers in factories possibly being the guinea pigs that we that let us know, sort of like the canary in the coal mine, that let us know that there's a problem of something in the environment. And then the next question is, what do we do about it? Question number one is, actually there's a whole nested series of questions that need to be answered. First off, someone has to notice that there is something going on. Second is that they then have to accumulate data. That takes a while. So people are still being exposed because we can't just willy-nilly shut things down and expect our economy to keep going. And businesses get really unhappy when you look at them and say, well, you got to shut down. Okay? You've got a problem here. So we have the issue of how do you actually get people to look at potential environmental source risks in the environment, and how do you weigh the costs and the benefits? This is where things get really dicey, because of course public health is, by its very nature, tends to be a little more anonymous than other kinds of healthcare. And it does so because when we're talking about public health, when we talk about public health issues, if we're not a victim, it's somebody else. And it's very, very difficult to justify in our own minds penalizing somebody else for something that's not affecting us yet. We don't know. And there's part of the problem. We don't know. The issue with public health is to assess these risks. Well, who's responsible for assessing it? If you look at the environment, we have the Environmental Protection Agency, and its mission is actually to protect public health and assure a clean environment. Well, when we think about health, we think about doctors and the FDA and the Department of Health and Human Services, but the Environmental Protection Agency is totally separate from all of those. It's an independent executive agency of the United States government, of the executive branch. So then we have people working with them, very, very dedicated human beings, working in the EPA to look at the various environmental risks. And they monitor. And they are probably in close liaison with the CDC and the Surgeon General and several others. But there are some other agencies that look at broad issues that are sort of public health, and one of them being the environment. There's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, which is part of yet another department, the Commerce Department of the United States. There's NASA, which is part of it, which is its own agency that monitors climate and provides data. And in fact, NASA, the scientists at NASA were some of the first to really bring to the fore that our globe is warming up and what are the risks of that warming. And we've all seen the political side of that, people denying that it's real, people trying to get scientists muzzled and fired. And we've seen them muzzled and fired because other people don't want to believe it or are not accepting it. They're denying the science. We have, and that's all bound up in a huge way with politics. So public health is a publicly political effort that is really difficult to deal with because you get rival agencies for one thing. And although they all work for the government and theoretically they all work for us, rivalries develop between them and they don't work together very well. They don't play in the same sandbox very well at all. And as a result, there's a lot of rivalry. Now, the rivalry is more with certain areas and certain individuals. Most of the people working in these agencies understand their role, and they work together quite well. But a lot of their bosses don't. And then the top of these agencies are all political appointees. So they all then, we see the winds, the direction of the breeze at the top change every time there's a change of administration. And it whipsaws back and forth. We talk about the current group of people in Congress. The Republican Party is in control of Congress, and there's a lot of people in there that are climate change deniers. Richard Nixon started the EPA, put it into place. When Americans began to realize in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, that their environment was getting destroyed. Industry was polluting, sewage plants were polluting, there were all sorts of things going on that were really creating problems. And so Nixon created the EPA. And we think of Nixon as a Republican, but he's an old line Republican and had a different attitude about a lot of things than the current crop of Republicans and Democrats. I mean, I'm not just dissing on the Republicans. Neither party is worth a bucket of warm spit, in my opinion. But the issue has been that this was all created under a Republican administration that was looking at globally at what was going on and responding to the needs of the community at the time. Since then, all of these things have become political. We've seen it. I don't know if you followed the news at all about the EPA and the current and the administrators, well, the now two administrators that have been associated with this administration. But they're very much not friends of the environment. They deny everything. And right now things are playing out in the courts. There's lawsuits about Flint, Michigan's water supply. And there are politicians who will tell you that Flint's water supply is fine. And then there are people in Flint who are going to look at you and say, yeah, you want to drink it? I see you don't live here. So there's a lot that's going on that is that is very, very difficult to understand. Let's see. Okay. Layla, I see that you're on. So, let's see. So if you have any questions, just speak up. I've got the earphones on now, and I can hear you. So the issues are many, and there are new issues every day. I mean, we get some high profile issues, like Flint, Michigan, like whatever local, regional, or whatever disaster has been occurring. We hear these things, but in reality, there are many. There are so many sources of environmental pollution that it's hard to keep track of them. There's an assault currently on the use of pesticides and artificial fertilizers in the foods because it's getting into the water table, which is harming wildlife, which is getting into the water supplies, and our water treatment plants are incapable of handling them. They just don't have the technology to do it. And that applies not just to those, but drug metabolites are appearing in large amounts in our water supplies, and in some cases, the bacteria that we use for treatment of water, for purification of water, are changing those metabolites back into active drug, and so it's a few. We've seen a few of those, but we're also seeing an awful lot of these things that go in. I think it was very telling. I lived in North Carolina for 20 years. Excuse me. And I think it's very telling that the city of Raleigh, which is the capital of is the biggest city in North Carolina. Charlotte is the biggest city that straddles North and South Carolina, but Raleigh is a big city. It's been growing like crazy. That whole area has been growing like topsy for the last years. They had problems. They looked at what was going on. Their sewage treatment facilities became clogged with the stuff that was being put into the sewage system. And a lot of it had to do with food waste that was going down garbage disposals. And the sewage system, the treatment system, was incapable of dealing with all of that material. And so they were looking at having to do a very, very expensive either total revamping or building new facilities. They were looking at spending $1 billion or more, which was not in anybody's budget. And they came up with a very creative solution. Since it was food waste going down garbage disposals, they banned garbage disposals. So new building, and building was going like crazy, new buildings could not put in garbage disposals. And if your garbage disposal failed, you couldn't buy a new one. So they solved the problem, and as I say, in a very creative way, saving billions of dollars, annoying the dickens out of the manufacturers of garbage disposals, I'm sure, and people that had been using them. Those of us that grew up in more rural areas and had to deal with septic systems already never put anything down a garbage disposal. But city folks don't understand that. And it just amazed me. But that was one way of dealing with it. And that was again, a public health solution at the local level. But on the national level, we also have all this wide range of agencies that are involved. The Department of Health and Human Services, as I said, the Department of the Interior in terms of dealing with Native American issues, health issues, public health issues, through the Indian Bureau of Medicine or whatever it is. But anyway, dealing with that, the Commerce Department with NOAA, we've got NASA, we've got the EPA, the State Department. We don't think about the fact that the State Department gets involved because pollution knows no boundaries and climate knows no boundaries. And there have been hundreds, if not more, of agreements around the world. You know, we talked about the Paris Treaty that this administration pulled us out of, but there are many, many other environmentally related treaties and public health related agreements around the world. These all have to be managed somehow. So the State Department's involved, and the UN, and our dealings with the UN. When the State Department's involved and treaties are involved, then that's another level of legislative interference because the Senate has to approve treaties. So we get all of these people in this big mix, and it's very difficult to get anything done. Then you add in the fact that it takes sometimes years, if not decades, to gather data to prove the relationship between some substance in the environment and a health risk. And then you have people who dedicate their lives to finding this information, and it may or may not that no one may, it may or may not be that anyone will deal with it. You know, everybody has an age at which they stop working. Once you stop working, if you know, you don't know what's going to happen. And a lot of times things just sort of die. The story of asbestos, as I gave some very, very sparse details, was not, asbestosis was not recognized as a disease until the 1920s, when the first case of pulmonary asbestosis was diagnosed. The company that this woman worked for, a textile company in Yorkshire in England, refused to have anything to do with accepting that their facility was partially responsible for her death. It took years for asbestosis to be accepted as a very dangerous substance in the environment. And as a result, when we see old buildings like schools being torn down, because asbestos went into everything up until the 70s, because it was a good insulating material, it was a good construction material, and it was fire resistant. And as long as you didn't disturb it, at least for some years, it was relatively innocuous. But the instant you messed it up, or if there was a fire or any sort of damage to a building, then we had asbestos particles in the air. And asbestos isn't a substance, it's a description. It's a fibrous material that's at least 6 different substances, six different minerals that are involved in it. It has more to do with the particle size than anything else. And it's very, very difficult to get people to accept that. Right now, there are some major lawsuits with the Monsanto Corporation over glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. And I just recently saw something, and I haven't read it. I need to pull it back up, actually, and circulate the article to the class. A man received a $289 million settlement in court. Now, chances are that settlement is going to be knocked way down in appellate court, if not completely set aside. But the issue is that he claims that glyphosate has harmed him and other people. And we know from research that glyphosate is actually a public health potential risk. We use it in our food crops. We spray it on our food crops to kill weeds. We've modified the food crops so that they're not susceptible to glyphosate. They can survive spraying to kill the weeds. Now, in the old days, I can remember, in the old days on the farm, you get out there with a hoe. and you dig them up. Now, huge factory farms, you can't take a hoe out. You can do that if you've got a 3-acre garden, like we did when I was a kid living in Virginia. You can't do that with a 10,000 acre farm. So they use these things. They modify the plants to put in a gene that resists the ability of glyphosate to impede the growth of the plant. Doesn't destroy the glyphosate, so the glyphosate accumulates in the plant. It is now known to be a gut irritant and to cause inflammation in the gut of human beings. We know that gut inflammation is related to probably 300 or 400 diseases, including autism. So we're wondering why we have an increase in all these diseases. And as we understand the gut biome and the relationship between inflammation of the gut and health, we begin to see that anything that enhances that inflammation, that gut inflammation, has the potential for being a public health risk. So there have been a lot of lawsuits. There's a lot of publicity about it. There's a lot of false information out there that people don't understand. I have a friend who goes on about this and will repeatedly say they put the glyphosate gene into a plant. No, they didn't. They did something else, something actually a little subtler than that. Putting the glyphosate gene in the plant would have been killing it. Okay, so they've done something different. So this major lawsuit, it'll be interesting to see if that holds. And I expect it won't. I mean, the courts have a problem with really excessive penalties. But California's already working on banning it. Has been for a while. If they haven't already, I haven't seen that they have. But I know they've been working on it because it is also related to cancers. So there's a lot, and this is taking, Monsanto has a treasure trove of lawyers, and they fight everything. They deny the science, they deny the data. And we know from the tobacco industry that many companies have no hesitation about suppressing data that can harm their product. We know the tobacco industry did that for years, which is one of the reasons that they are having problems now. Fortunately, smoking is declining, as we all know from studying, the issue of smoking last week. But we know that the issue of smoking is declining. Kathleen Sebelius, in one of the Surgeon General's reports, was predicting that smoking would not we'd do away with smoking within a generation, and I think she's absolutely wrong, because we might reduce it in the United States, but I understand that it's pretty rampant. If you go to some place like China or Japan, and Europe, the level of smoking is really incredible. So will we be rid of smoking within a generation? I have a great deal of skepticism, and that is a known environmental hazard, especially secondhand smoke. That's why we have all sorts of laws that ban smoking in public places, and it will continue. But it still doesn't do away with it, and people are using it. And the thing is that what apparently is, for all intents and purposes, has a probability of being at least as risky, is vaping. Although the data are definitely not solid and not in yet. There are indications, but no solid data that vaping is at least as bad as smoking, because higher nicotine levels. So we have lots of these things, and the entrenched interests, corporate interests, and others do everything they can to deny the science and to deflect that criticism and blame it on other things. This is one of the reasons it's very difficult to prove that anything in our environment is harmful, because first off, there are millions of things in our environment. And just like drugs, we don't know how they interact with each other in the human body. And maybe glyphosate itself is harmless, but mixed in with 2 or 3 other things that we also have in fairly immeasurable amounts in our environment, it may be that interaction that is the problem. And proving that is an exercise in real scientific rigor that will take a long time, if that's the case at all. So we don't really know, at least not well enough. So the other things, environmental, the production of food. I mean, there are, setting aside the objections that vegetarians have to meat animals, which we won't go into. The production of food is a really filthy business. The first environmental, the first actual food and drug laws in this country concern the production of food. If you remember the Food and Drug, the Food Safety Act or whatever it was of 1906, the very first Food and Drug Acts that were passed were to deal with contamination of the food supply, and came out of Upton Sinclair's writing about the grapes of wrath and other, writing about the conditions in the production factories of our food. And if you have heard stories about the various chicken processors and the conditions of those plants, you might be tempted to become a vegetarian, because it's pretty horrific. When we were in North Carolina, when a couple of the plants were basically shut down because they were so filthy. It was just incredible. Since then, of course, the food producers have cleaned up their act. Bad pun, I guess. Have actually done a better job of changing the conditions, but there's still plenty of violations. And it really was kind of interesting to see that, and hear and be a part of looking at the way this environment came into being. So the problem with environmental issues is that it doesn't matter what you put into the environment. There's a lot of noise, and because we have so many different things in the environment, it's very difficult to tease the noise away from the facts, because someone is always talking about how horrible our food is, or how terrible this activity is or that activity, and yet we don't have hard data about a lot of it. And that's really what these risk assessments in the environment require, is data, hard, fast data. And as I said, it's difficult to accumulate it. It's difficult to bring it forward and find it, because it's hard to acquire. And the real, the objective measures of proof that we've established might very well be far too stringent to be able to assess these things and make rational decisions in a relatively short time. Many of the environmental issues that we've seen, pollution from lead and mercury, only has been recognized after long years of research. In some cases, the research was in workers working in these places. We became aware of various forms of silicosis through black lung disease in coal miners. Another thing that was denied for a long time by the coal mining industry. But the fact is that people who didn't work in coal mines didn't have the disease, basically. Very few would develop anything resembling it. That was a relatively easy one to prove. Asbestosis was also relatively easy. Lead was also kind of easy because we've known that lead is a problem since ancient days. We just, but many things, new things going into the environment. It took years to understand the problem with chlorofluorocarbon refrigerants and what it was doing to the ozone layer. Now that we've banned those, the ozone layer is beginning to regenerate. So we know that we can affect solutions. And it forced the refrigerant industry into looking for alternatives. And I would hope that people are actually looking at those alternatives as well to see what unexpected consequences arise from using them. And there are always unexpected consequences. And again, we have to, when we start evaluating these things, we need to look at the risk of the contaminant, the risk of the substance that we're talking about, versus the benefit of having them available. Some of the most toxic things that we deal with in industry are heavy metals and rare earths that are absolutely necessary for things like this computer. We don't have alternatives to these things. And so what happens is not only are the heavy metals and rare earths themselves toxic, but the process of harvesting them is environmentally destructive and involves usually a lot of runoff, a lot of pollution going into the waters. And while in the United States we've been making some progress in making certain that the effluent from these processing plants is a lot cleaner than it used to be, you can bet that the Chinese aren't doing that, or the Indians, because they're too busy trying to build an economy. Other areas around, I had a man that I used to meet with regularly when I was in the pharmaceutical industry. He was working for a biotech company in Pennsylvania, and we used to meet on a regular basis. And he was a self-described uber conservative. And then he had a chance to go to East Germany before the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. He was over in East Germany in the mid-'80s. And he said, when I came out of East Germany, I was an environmentalist because it was so bad. So there are lots of places that we have been doing a lot of this. My daughter lived in Slovakia for 2 years. Slovakia was one of the dumping grounds for the Soviet Union's nuclear waste. And there are parts of that country that are fairly polluted, which is a shame. It's a beautiful country and beautiful people. But, that's what we have to deal with. Radiation is a hazard. We have it all around us. I mean, in Colorado, most of our homes are equipped with radon pumps because we have bentonite soils which contain radon. So we have levels of radon that are acceptable. Anything above that, we have to install radon pumps in order to pull it, to not have it accumulate in the house. Radon's a heavy gas, so we can't afford to have it accumulating in the house, and it's radioactive and associated with cancers. But not only that, but we have, we have the controversies in Colorado over fracking. And if you listen to the arguments, the pro-fracking folks tell us that there's absolutely no environmental harm. And the anti-fracking folks say, you got to be kidding. I mean, you're pumping water into the ground. There has to be environmental harm of some sort. And again, from what I can tell, the jury's still out on that one. The data are just not solid. I mean, you can sit there and logically say that's got to be causing some harm, but where's the harm? You have to show it, because again, we have a complex system that's incredibly resilient. I mean, we've lived, this planet's been here for 4 or 5 billion years. It's gone through a lot of disasters, asteroid strikes and climate change and ice ages, and times when it's been hotter than blazes and other times when it's been cold. Somehow or another, it's survived. So it's an amazingly resilient system, but you can only stress it so far. But the thing is, although there's some dispute on this, one asteroid strike wiped out the dinosaurs because it changed the entire climate of the planet. And we are seeing a time when our climate is changing rapidly, and we got 7.5 billion of us on this globe right now. And there are some people that say it can't support that many. There are others that say that with the right farming and food distribution techniques, we can support 12 billion. I have no idea who's right, because I haven't seen the solid data. So, comments? What are your thoughts about environmental issues, especially risks of substances in the environment? I don't want to get into arguments or discussions about things that we can't do anything about, like climate change and that sort of thing, but what about substances in the environment?
I just want to know, is there some way to filter the drugs out of water?
Okay, so Layla just asked if there was some way you could filter the drugs out of water. The answer to that is, at a molecular level, that's extremely difficult. We would have to design what we call molecular sieves, which are expensive ceramic and metal structures that would entrap specific drug molecules, unfortunately. Probably have to do that with our current science. It's not saying that this can't change, but we'd have to do that. The other, I think, a potentially more viable solution would be to use laboratory methods and laboratory evolutionary methods to actually breed bacterial species that would metabolize drugs. Now, the only problem with that is we'd have to be careful that those were safe to have around in our system. But that is one thing. That's the basis of much of our water purification is bacterial in nature. We have bacteria that consume many of the wastes and many of the components. But the problem is that we're putting more stuff in, and we have more drugs all the time, and we're using more drugs. And I think we're overwhelming the system. But a filtration method at the molecular level would be extremely expensive. At least, again, current technology would be extremely expensive.
And I would be afraid that in many cases we'd have to design specific filtration technologies for every drug, or at least every major structural class of drugs. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So that's just that's my feeling. Am I absolutely right about that? You know, I hesitate to make any predictions about where science can't go, because the instant you say something can't happen, somebody does it. But I have actually seen some things that could be called molecular sieves, which basically are nanoparticles that can absorb things. We can absorb some using fairly simple technologies like charcoal, or aeration filtration. Sometimes will take care of microbiological contaminations, but drugs are a different beast, because they go in so many different forms, from unmetabolized drugs to metabolites. Hopefully most of the metabolites are inactive, but we don't want them accumulating in our environment either. So anyway, that's basically my response to that. Brandy, do you have any thoughts?
Is that like the same, I guess, process as like well water?
Okay. So Brandy's asking if that's the same process as well water. Again, well water depends on chemical, physical, and biological filtration techniques. And depending on where you are, your well water has different contaminants. We have some very good friends who live in Michigan, north of Detroit. And the water up there is awful. They're on a well. Everybody up in their area has been on a well, and the water is awful. The filtration works, the filters that they put in work for about a week, and then you start getting this awful sulfurous smell and taste in the water. So you have to buy new filters. That gets expensive. Bacterial filters are risky because they only take out very specific things. Bacterial approaches probably are much more suited to clean up of certain kinds of environmental disasters like oil spills. But chemical filters, a lot of it is charcoal, activated charcoal, which I think that's the basis for like the Brita filters, is activated charcoal. And other filtration devices I've seen use that. Nanoparticles of silver, very, very small particles of silver, have been used as well. But unfortunately, we have found, and in fact, they were used actually, they were put into things like socks so that socks wouldn't stink. It would absorb the foot odors and deactivate, destroy the chemicals, and so your socks wouldn't stink. Well, the claim was that the nanoparticles of silver were permanently fixed into the socks, and that turned out to be a lie, or perhaps a politer term as an exaggeration. But the fact is, we started seeing these nanoparticles of silver in the environment, and they started killing fish. So we can come up with solutions to one problem, but we need to be careful that that solution doesn't cause yet another in the environment. Okay, but there's lots of technology. I mean, we filter our water at home. Loveland has fairly good water. except in high summer when often there's a taste to it. Well, you were here the other night when Brandy Jackson was here and said that Lake Loveland had been contaminated with E. coli. So there's always risks of that. And E. coli can be annoying or it can be deadly. So there's all sorts of these things that go on. Let's see. Okay, it's 7 o'clock. Let's go ahead and take a break for about 15 minutes. Layla, we're going to take a break. So I'll be back on in about 15 minutes.
Alrighty.
Okay. Okay, let's start up class again. The issue of environment, your book covers it in several different topics. The environment is everything around us that we live in. So it involves air. We all know about air pollution. It involves water. We know about water pollution. We know it's a problem. It involves cleaning up our food supply. It involves looking at how we deal with waste, solid waste, liquid waste, semi-solid waste. All of these things are a major issue. The food supply is a public health issue as well. And again, many different agencies involved. Drugs, we know the FDA is involved. But the other thing to remember about all of this is we're talking, we've been speaking about federal level agencies, but state and local governments have many of the responsibilities. First off, drinking water is the responsibility of the local government. Local government can't do a whole lot about air pollution. It can stop major polluters from putting things into the air or not. It again is going to be dependent on where you are and how much they're willing to go into it. We go to different places and we can tell where we are. Greeley always smells like a cow town. Head over to Fort Morgan, it's worse. If the breeze is going the wrong way, it's even worse yet. Well, beets is one, but they also have, meat packing plants there. In fact, it's why little bitty Fort Morgan has a big Somali population, because they go there to work because they can get jobs. And, the people in town seem to be accepting them fairly well. So, there's just a lot that does go on, and it's hard to know precisely what can be done about it. As I said, pollution knows no boundaries. Air and water pollution go from between states and cities, and so we need to have some sort of overall strategy. But still, when the local government wants to assert its control, which it has the right to do under our Constitution, there's not a whole lot we can do about it, short of causing political chaos. So anyway, this whole section on environmental issues gives you, I think, a good feel for some of the difficulties of public health in general. Clearly, public health is about trying to prevent health problems. That's the major focus. But on an individual basis, that's hard to do, especially when there are many other factors, many players in the game, all of whom have their own agendas. So, and some of them are intractable problems. One of our biggest risks on this planet is becoming understood very well by a lot of people is the sheer mass of people. You know, we talk about people, you know, human activity not contributing to global warming. We got 7.5 billion of us on this planet. Our body temperatures are significantly higher than that of our surroundings. So we're radiating heat all the time. On top of that, we heat our houses in the winter and we cool our houses in the summer, all of which generate heat into the environment. We pour at least 60% of the energy that we harvest from power generation, no matter what mechanism we are using, whether it's hydropower, whether it's coal or oil or even nuclear. At least 60% of that energy is lost into the environment as heat, which is the most random form of energy, and that's why it goes away as heat. We have technologies that could be deployed that could harvest probably most of that 60% and convert it into usable power. But still, what are we going to use the power for? Again, heating our homes in the winter, cooling our homes in the summer, running factories, and generating large amounts of heat. Our automobiles, very inefficient in terms of energy use. Pour out a lot of heat. Park your car in your garage. It's a great way to warm it up in the winter and a great way to really heat it up in the summer. So, you know, there's just an awful lot of things that we as humans do. So our population has a lot to do with it. It stresses our ability to produce food. It stresses our ability to have clean, potable water for everyone who needs it. It stresses our ability to live in a more distributed fashion because we're seeing we've consolidated most of our population into cities. China now has something like 60 to 70% of its population in cities, whereas at the time of Mao's revolution, only about 20% of the population lived in cities. And that is now less than 60 years ago. Well, 70. About 70 years ago that occurred, that change started happening. So we've seen quite a bit of consolidation. India is the same way. People are moving into the cities. And India and China, between them, have more than a third of the entire world's population. Just two countries. So we're seeing quite a bit of change in terms of that. Moving into the cities means generating more energy. Living out in the country, you didn't need to generate all that energy. Most people don't have air conditioning, and in most of India, they don't need heat other than to cook. So we have seen a big change, and population growth is one of our public health issues. The more people consolidate, the more, as I said, the more infectious disease spreads. TB is on the rise. TB is a major scourge in India now, but it's on the rise now again in the United States. Especially in group situations like prisons and halfway houses and so forth. Excuse me. Okay. So do you have any questions or comments, either of you? Okay. This week's discussion is about in the environment, so we won't. We've talked enough about that, I think. The assignment 2 of this week. Assignment 1 is the usual, to read the chapters and write a small paper on that topic. Assignment 2 is looking at the EPA website and finding if the link that's entitled "Learn About Where You Live" is not available, just search for it. Do a search, learning on that. And it's in a box called My Environment. So if you can't find that box, if it's been moved off that homepage where you land, go ahead and do a search for My Environment. And I'll check and make sure that that's working, so that we know that. So because I had to change last week's assignment, it's not due until the end of this week either. So, and if you turn this assignment in by the beginning of class on Monday, that's fine. Now, next week is our last week of class. So let's just take a quick preview. You're going to read several chapters of the book that will be part of your, some of the information will appear in the final assessment. Come on, wake up. So you're reading chapters 25, 26, I may have to look at that. Hold on. That might be wrong. It's not. Let's see. We may have to change that.
Yeah, 'cause this week was 20 through 25.
Yeah, it should be 26. Yeah, that should be 26 and 27 and 30 and 31. Okay.
Their PowerPoints are 25, 26, 29, and 30.
And they should be 26, 27, 30, and 31. And those are the chapters that you should be reading as well.
Up top it says the right chapters.
Yeah, it's just this is something that wasn't changed from before. I did change the chapters up there, but I forgot to change the PowerPoints, but that's all right. So, and next week on Monday, we'll come together and talk about, some of the issues for the week. And then Wednesday, we'll have a final. Okay. Layla, do you have any questions? Well, I'm going to assume not. So for those of you who are not here, so Layla and Brandy, you don't need to do this. For those of you who are not here, when you listen to to this recording, I want you to send me an email, and in the email, I'd like you to put the word Mumbai, M-U-M-B-A-I, into the email so that I know that you've actually listened to this recording. at this point, since we just have a couple of us here, what I'm going to do is stop the formal part of the class and encourage people to work. I'd like you to stay until 8:30, Brandy, and just work on your assignments, okay? Layla, if you can hear me, then go ahead and do what you have to do, but let's get these things in. Don't forget the daily checkpoints, and don't forget that you have an assessment this week as well. So we'll end the class here, the formal part of the class here, and I'll see you all on Monday.
All right, Mike.
Okay. All right. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thanks.